I was ordered to turn my own camera against itself to cut and dissolve the evidence of what our guns had done over Sicily. In the red light of the darkroom, the transports burned again on wet paper, while my superiors spoke of morale, security, discipline. The scissors hovered over the negatives, and the room seemed to shrink with every frame that curled toward the solvent. I obeyed just enough to remain a good soldier, and disobeyed just enough to keep a few thin strips of truth hidden against my heart. On the night of the 11th of July 1943, over the black water south of Sicily, Allied transport planes flew in tight, nervous formations toward the invasion beaches. The landings in southern Europe had begun only a few days earlier. The whole operation was huge, complicated, and still very fragile. Ships, landing craft, and aircraft were all funneled through the same narrow corridors of sea and sky. The anti-aircraft crews on the ships stayed keyed up, watching the dark fingers close to the triggers, never entirely sure what might appear next. In that kind of tension, one mistake was enough to turn friendly guns on friendly men. On a nearby island, in a seized villa that now served as headquarters, a military photographer was getting ready for the night. He was not an infantryman, yet he lived almost as close to danger as they did. His job was to create images for reports, briefings, and propaganda. He belonged to the US Army Signal Corps, one of many small teams scattered along the front with the task of putting the war on film. He followed the same ritual before every mission. He checked the shutter on his speed graphic. Then he counted his film holders, cleaned the lenses, and made sure he had spare flashbulbs within reach. He kept a small notebook in his pocket with times, locations, and short notes for each frame. The job had its own rhythm. He photographed soldiers climbing into landing craft. He captured officers hunched over maps, mechanics under the wings of planes, medics bent over stretchers. A lot of what he shot felt routine. Some moments were staged. Men were asked to smile, to wave, to look confident. He understood perfectly well that part of his job was to feed the system with images that could safely be shown back home. He knew that every photograph went through several pairs of eyes. Field censors checked for anything sensitive. Higher officers chose the pictures that fit the story they wanted to tell. One of steady advances and meaningful sacrifice. He had already learned exactly what that system liked. Clean, orderly scenes of troops boarding ships. Calm, almost tender images of soldiers writing letters, reading mail, or gathered at a field mass. Sometimes a shot of smashed enemy equipment. What the system rarely embraced were photographs of confusion, panic, or obvious Allied mistakes. Those frames were often set aside quietly at the field level. Sometimes they were sent forward and then simply never used. He had seen prints covered with pencil marks and then sealed into envelopes. Sometimes the negatives were there one day and gone the next. On this particular night, his assignment looked simple on the page. And he was to stay near the coastal road and an improvised landing strip where returning aircraft could be diverted if they had to. His orders told him to document the airborne effort in general terms. Photograph crews getting ready, planes overhead, and, if he could, any successful landings. Nothing in writing said anything about what might go wrong, but he knew that the air and sea around that island were crowded to the limit. He had listened to gunners complain that nobody warned them clearly when friendly planes were due to pass. He had listened to pilots complain that ships opened fire at the first hint of movement. Around the mess tables, these sounded like the usual gripes that follow any big operation. In the darkness, those same complaints could suddenly feel more serious. He moved out with a small support team. There was a driver, a radio operator, and 2 infantrymen assigned as security. They jolted along rutted roads in a jeep, passing dusty convoys inching toward the coast. The air smelled of fuel, cordite, and salt drifting in from the sea. Far away, the horizon flickered with gun flashes. Lines of tracer fire climbed from ships and coastal batteries. The photographer noted the time in his notebook. He took a few long-distance shots, thin streaks of light crossing the sky, ghostly outlines of ships against the darkness. At first, it felt like any other night bombardment. Then the pattern changed. The fire grew thicker and more continuous. The radio operator began to pick up broken, tense messages. There was confusion about the planes flying over the fleet. Some voices insisted they were enemy, and others insisted they were friendly. The photographer watched one faint aircraft silhouette suddenly flare bright. A ball of orange light opened in the sky. A dull thud rolled across the water a moment later. A transport had been hit. Everyone in the jeep stared up in silence. Another flare followed, then another. Parachutes appeared for a moment in the glow of the burning planes, then vanished back into the dark. The photographer lifted his camera almost without thinking. He pressed the shutter, changed film holders, and pressed it again. The exposures were long and the focus uncertain, but he was still getting something on film. His driver asked if they should move closer. The security men hesitated. Their orders did not allow them to move towards the shore while the anti-aircraft guns were still firing. So they stayed on the road but edged closer to a low hill that gave them a better view of the sea. From there, the photographer could see much more. The sky over the water had turned into a tight web of light. Tracer rounds climbed, curved, and fell back. Some transports tried to turn away. Others held course, parachutes drifted into the fire. Some never made it down to the water. The photographer did not feel heroic. He was following habit and training. His job was to record what happened. Others would decide what it meant. He framed the long lines of ships, the curtains of tracer fire, and the faint shapes of aircraft trapped in between. He shifted his angle again and again. His fingers were numb as he pushed fresh film holders into place. He could smell burned cordite on the wind even from that distance. Eventually the firing eased. The sky went dark again. The radio operator, pale and shaken, said very little. From scattered messages, a picture began to form. The planes were friendly. American and Allied crews had been shot down by Allied guns. There were mentions of navigation mistakes, confused instructions, and recognition signals that had not been seen or understood. The photographer wrote 2 words in his notebook, underlined them, then drew a pale line through them without really crossing them out. Friendly fire. He understood exactly what that meant. It was the kind of accident official statements almost never admitted clearly. Orders came through for the jeep to return to the villa. The road back was crowded with ambulances and trucks pushing toward the coast. At one crossroads, he saw medics lifting a stretcher into a vehicle. On it lay a man in a burned flight suit, motionless, boots gone, hair scorched. The photographer paused, then took a single shot. He avoided any identifying details, framing only the shape of a body and the blurred movement of medics around him. The security men frowned but kept quiet. Everyone knew the public rarely saw detailed images of their own wounded, especially this early in the war. Back at the villa, the basement served as a rough processing room. The smell of chemicals hung in the air. Bare bulbs cast a tired yellow light. On one wall, a chart listed the priority categories for photographs: operational, intelligence, propaganda. The photographer passed his film holders to the darkroom technician. They said little. Both were exhausted. The technician slipped into his own routine. Negatives went into developing tanks, were gently agitated, rinsed, and hung on lines to dry. In another room, a field press officer sat at a typewriter putting together the first reports of the night. The first official version played down the friendly losses and highlighted the continued progress of the invasion. The staff officer who dealt with higher command was already deciding what could be released to the public and what had to be held back. Upstairs, a liaison from the propaganda section read the early reports. Friendly aircraft had been hit by fire from Allied ships. Dozens of men were dead or missing. He immediately understood how dangerous this story would be if shown in full. It could hurt morale, it could shake confidence in planning and leadership, and it could reveal weaknesses in coordination that the enemy might study and use. He made a note to go down to the photographic section. In the dark room, the first negatives from the night were ready. The photographer and the technician leaned over them under the red light. The images were grainy and blurred by long exposure and motion. But they were clear enough. Streaks of tracer climbed from ships in neat lines. Transport aircraft were faint but visible. In one frame, a transport had been caught at the moment of explosion, its body torn open by light. In another, a cluster of parachutes glowed for a heartbeat in the glare of burning fuel. The technician let out a quiet breath through his teeth. It was not admiration. It was recognition that these were exactly the kind of images censors usually did not want in circulation. After the press officer arrived first, he studied the negatives with a magnifier. His face hardened. He knew what they showed. He also knew that high command would want some sort of visual record for internal reports. Commanders would need to see the pattern and scale of what had gone wrong. He told the photographer to prepare a small set of contact prints. Nothing big and no extra copies, just enough for internal use. He reminded him that everything would be reviewed. The photographer nodded. This was standard procedure. He made the prints. As the images slowly appeared in the trays under the safe light, details sharpened. Lines of jets, arcs of fire, thin silhouettes of planes, the figure on the stretcher at the crossroads. The press officer chose a few prints and slipped them into a folder, and he wrote a short classification note in pencil, for internal use only, no release. He left the rest of the prints where they lay on the table. The photographer asked if any of the frames would be sent out to the newspapers. The answer came quickly. No, not for the press. The propaganda liaison arrived soon after. He had already talked to the operations staff about the incident. His instructions were more direct and colder. He wanted to see every negative from that night. The technician handed him the strips hanging on the line. He checked them one by one, his mouth set in a tight line. He asked whether any copies had been made. He asked about the photographer's notes. He made it very clear that any image showing a clear pattern of friendly fire was not to leave secure storage. Then he stepped across a line. And he ordered that some of the negatives be destroyed. He pointed at specific frames: the exploding transport, the parachutes in the glow, the stretcher beside the road. He argued that the images could expose convoy formations, anti-aircraft layouts and air routes. He said enemy analysts could study them. He also warned that they could spark questions at home that commanders did not want to face while the campaign was still underway. The photographer listened without interrupting. Destroying negatives was not something he had never heard of. He knew it had happened in other theatres and earlier phases of the war, but rarely had anyone stood in front of him and said it so plainly. Usually the process was quieter. Pictures simply vanished into envelopes and filing cabinets and were never seen again. And now the order was out in the open. Destroy these. The technician hesitated. Destroying film worked against everything he had been trained to do, but he was also a soldier. Orders were not optional. The liaison repeated that this was necessary. He wrapped the instruction in words about security and discipline. At that moment, the photographer felt that a line had been drawn inside him. On one side was his duty as a soldier to obey and to protect operations. On the other side was his duty as a witness, to keep a visual record of what had actually happened. He did not think of himself as a rebel or a hero. He saw himself as a working man with a camera, doing the jobs he was given. But he also understood that once negatives were destroyed, the events they showed existed only in memory and reports, that he knew how memory bends and fades, especially under stress. The liaison left after repeating his order. The press officer stayed. He looked at the photographer and the technician and said the order still stood. He added that they needed to be careful. There were people who did not want those images appearing anywhere. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten them. Yet the warning was clear all the same. The technician picked up a pair of scissors and walked to the drying line. He began cutting the film into individual frames. Some would be kept in a sealed envelope for internal study. Others were marked for destruction. The photographer watched for a moment, then stepped closer. He asked if he could run through the frames once more so he could correct his notes. The technician passed him the marked strips. One at a time. In that short window, the photographer made his choice. He picked out a few of the negatives that were supposed to be destroyed. He slipped them into the inner pocket of his field jacket, behind a stack of papers. Did it quickly and without any drama. The technician noticed. He stopped for a second. Their eyes met. Then the technician turned back to the rest of the film and went on working. He said nothing. His silence was its own kind of decision. The remaining negatives that showed clear faces or detailed layouts of ships were cut and dropped into a metal container. A small amount of solvent was poured over them. The emulsion turned cloudy, softened, and peeled away from the base. The images were gone. The photographer inhaled the sharp chemical smell and understood that a part of that night's history had just been erased. He also felt the slight weight of the rescued frames against his chest. He did not feel brave. He felt that he had refused, quietly, to let everything be wiped clean. In the days that followed, the official account of the incident settled into a familiar shape. Reports to the press mentioned losses among airborne troops. They referred to intense anti-aircraft fire without saying whose guns had fired. They stressed enemy action. They did not plainly state that many of the shells had been Allied. This fit a larger pattern of wartime censorship. Governments on all sides controlled information to protect ongoing operations and keep morale up, and that often meant hiding blunders and friendly fire. And inside headquarters, internal inquiries tried to understand what had gone wrong. Charts showed flight paths and ship positions. Recommendations were drawn up about recognition signals, radio discipline, and coordination between air and sea. Some technical changes followed. But the wider public, and even many soldiers in other units, never saw the photographs that might have made those discussions more concrete. The photographer kept working. He documented the push inland, the shifting control of villages, columns of prisoners being marched away. He photographed engineers rebuilding bridges and crews unloading ships and trucks. Some days the war looked strangely orderly through his viewfinder. Other days it looked completely unpredictable. He found a way to live with what he had done in the darkroom. And he kept filing his regular negatives, he wrote captions, he reported for each new assignment. At night, when the villa was quiet, he sometimes opened the map case where he had hidden the rescued frames. They were tucked into a small envelope. Only the technician knew about them, and he kept his silence. Those images made the friendly fire incident feel solid in a way that typed reports never could. They showed the shape of the disaster, the thickness of the fire, the tiny fragile parachutes hanging in a sky lit by friendly guns. He did not know exactly what he meant to do with them. He only knew that if the negatives stayed with him, they might someday serve as proof that the incident had happened the way people remembered. Weeks turned into months. The fighting moved north. He followed units into new terrain. And he captured images of bombed cities, mountain roads packed with vehicles, and civilians trapped between advancing and retreating forces. He also saw other kinds of control and manipulation. Posters produced by propaganda offices, newsreels cut from carefully chosen fragments, stories that celebrated bravery and quietly pushed confusion out of frame. His sense of his own role changed. He stayed loyal to his side. He did not wish them to lose. He did not enjoy the idea of damaging morale. Yet he had seen how easily uncomfortable truths could be softened until they were barely there. He began to see every negative, even a poor one, as a small defense against complete forgetting. Months later, in another headquarters on the Italian mainland, the hidden negatives came under threat again. A new security officer took over. So he liked to review everything. He checked documents, film supplies, and how the photographic section handled its work. He had a background in counterintelligence and believed leaks could start in small informal ways, including through photographs. He went back over the records from the night of the friendly fire incident. He compared the number of film holders signed out with the number of negatives in the archive. The figures did not line up perfectly. A small mismatch could be explained by bad exposures or lost frames. But the officer was suspicious by nature. He questioned the technician first. The technician kept his answers vague. He spoke of damaged negatives, processing mistakes, and frames that had been destroyed on orders. The officer pushed for detail. He asked who gave those orders. And he asked whether anyone had logged the destruction. He took notes carefully. Then he called in the photographer. They met in a small plain office with a single window. The tone stayed calm but firm. The officer asked about that night's assignment. He asked how many frames had been shot. He asked whether any personal copies existed. The photographer chose his words cautiously. He admitted that some frames had been damaged or destroyed as instructed. He did not mention the rescued negatives. The officer asked if he understood the importance of discipline with sensitive material. The photographer said that he did. The officer reminded him that keeping negatives without authorization could be seen as intending to leak information. In theory, it could be interpreted as providing aid and comfort to the enemy. The words were heavy and formal. The photographer felt the tension settle in the room. He denied having any material outside official channels. The officer studied his face for a moment, then moved on. The interview ended without charges, but a note went into his file. Later, the press officer who had moved with the unit spoke quietly with the photographer. He told him to be careful. The war, he said, already had enough tragedies. The last thing anyone needed was another one caused by an internal investigation. He did not ask directly about hidden negatives. He may have guessed the truth. He may also have preferred not to know for certain. That night, the photographer weighed his choices. He could destroy the remaining negatives himself and fully obey the earlier order. Then he could hide them in a sealed envelope within the general archive and hope they might surface one day without his name attached. He could also keep them with him until the war ended, living with the risk. He chose the second option. He placed the small envelope into a larger one. On the front he wrote, into careful neutral handwriting, a simple label. Night Operations, Sicily, July 1943. He did not write anything about friendly fire. Then he waited for the right moment. A few days later, he was told to accompany a courier to a rear area where film and documents were being packed for shipment to a central repository. In the records room, surrounded by boxes and binders, he slipped his envelope into a crate full of mixed photographic material. It was not a clever plan, it was a quiet act of hiding. Either the crate would be sealed and sent to a bigger depot. There it might be roughly catalogued, or it might be misfiled, damaged, or forgotten. Either way, the images had a chance to survive beyond the reach of the people who had ordered their destruction. As he left the building, he felt a small lift inside. He no longer carried the negatives on his body. His personal risk had dropped. He had also given up control. Whether anyone would ever see those images now depended on processes he could not predict. The war moved on. Other operations and battles pushed the Sicilian night from most people's minds. The photographer eventually finished his service. He went home with ordinary discharge papers. He took a few approved prints as keepsakes, but none from the friendly fire incident. He returned to civilian life quietly, and he rarely spoke in detail about his wartime work. If people asked, he talked about general conditions, not specific disasters. He did not think of himself as a whistleblower or a victim of censorship. He understood that in war, decisions about information were made under pressure and with limited clarity. Even so, he did not forget the negatives that had been destroyed and the ones he had tried to save. Far away from his home, archives were filling up with boxes of wartime photographs. Signal Corps material was shipped into national repositories. Some pictures were displayed or printed. Many more stayed in boxes, tagged with only brief descriptions. Years later, historians and curators began digging through them. They uncovered unfamiliar angles on well-known events. They also stumbled across pieces of stories that had barely appeared in the official record. In one archive, a researcher studying friendly fire during the invasion of Sicily asked to see photographs from air and naval operations in July 1943. A staff member brought out several boxes. Inside were negatives and contact sheets labelled in broad, simple terms: beaches, convoys, night operations. One envelope carried a handwritten label from years before. Night Operations, Sicily, July 1943. The researcher started with the contact prints. He saw tracer fire over the sea, ships picked out by faint light, parachutes hanging halfway to the water. He recognized what he was looking at. The patterns matched written accounts of the friendly fire event. He noticed classification marks and stamps. Some frames were scarred or worn, but what they showed was still clear. He understood that these photographs added something that text alone could not give. They did not change the core facts. They did, however, show the scale and feel of the incident in a direct way. He traced the envelope's path as far as surviving records allowed. He found a reference to a field lab in a villa on an island. He found the name of a Signal Corps photographer attached to that unit at the time. Beyond that, the trail thinned out. Personnel files had gaps. Some documents were gone. The photographer, now very old or already dead, was out of reach. The researcher still chose to use the images. He wrote about the incident carefully. He placed the photographs within the broader story of censorship and propaganda in wartime, and he explained how governments then often tried to shape what the public could see of the fighting. He avoided jumping to conclusions that the evidence could not support. He did not claim that publishing those pictures during the war would have changed everything. He simply treated them as a missing piece of a complicated story. When his study appeared, the images were reproduced in a modest way. They appeared in journals and books. Captions explained what was known: nighttime anti-aircraft fire over Allied convoys, friendly aircraft lost. The authors pointed out that some negatives from the sequence were clearly missing. From the gaps in paperwork, they concluded that some had probably been destroyed on purpose. They also suggested that a few frames had survived thanks to some quiet act of preservation that remained undocumented. The full story of the photographer's decision was not told because the sources did not spell it out. Yet that decision was still present in the survival of the pictures themselves. People who studied the reproduction saw more than streaks of light and blurred shapes. They saw a moment when a system built to defend its own soldiers had turned against them. They also saw the result of one small refusal to let that moment disappear completely. Inside military institutions, the legacy of the incident took a different shape. Training manuals on aircraft recognition, communication, and coordination between air and sea sometimes referred to early friendly fire episodes as case studies, including the one off Sicily. Those materials rarely included photographs. They relied on diagrams and text. The images remained mostly in the world of archives and scholarship. For the families of those who died that night, the photographs were largely unknown. Their idea of what had happened came from official letters and occasional press summaries. Some may have encountered the pictures decades later. Many probably never did. The gap between what institutions knew and what they chose to share stayed in place. When the photographer's name did appear in print, it was usually buried in lists, a credit line in an archive, a mention among many. He did not become well known. He received no public honours. His real contribution lay in steady work under pressure, and in one quiet decision not to obey completely. that decision did not break the system. And it did not end censorship, but it allowed one fragment of reality to move forward in time. Looking back on his story, attention naturally shifts to the structures around him. The censors, press officers, and propaganda planners who decided which images were acceptable. The offices where people argued about showing photographs of dead or wounded soldiers. The constant balancing act between telling the truth and sustaining support for the war. In that environment, a camera was both an asset and a danger. It could support the official story. It could also threaten it by preserving moments that did not fit. The photographer worked inside those limits. He knew he could not simply publish everything he saw. He also knew that destroying negatives was final, a closed-off future understanding. And by pulling a few frames out of the solvent's reach and hiding them inside the flow of material going to an archive, he acted at the very edge of his role. Not fully obedient, not openly defiant. The images he saved are now a small but real part of how friendly fire in the Second World War is remembered. They stand next to after-action reports, survivor accounts, and official letters. Together, these sources help later generations see that war is not only made of clear victories and defeats, it is also made of errors, misjudgments, and tragedies that institutions sometimes try to hide. The story of the photographer who was told to destroy his negatives is not a separate footnote. It is woven into the war itself. It shows the tension between protecting and acknowledging, and between holding morale together and facing what actually happened. For people listening today, the existence of these images is a reminder that even in tightly controlled systems, individual choices still matter. Small decisions about what to keep and what to let go can shape what the future knows. The photographer's life ended quietly. He never saw every debate that his images would later touch. Yet his everyday work, done with care and a steady conscience, left a mark. That mark invites us to think about how war is remembered, who shapes the hat memory, and how photographs can hold not only official triumphs, but also the losses that were meant to stay unseen. For anyone who listens to stories like this, there is value in continuing to look for the forgotten corners of history, in honouring those who paid attention, and in supporting the work of preserving and studying the fragile traces they left. If this story has helped bring one of those hidden corners into the light, then it deserves to be shared, passed on, and kept alive in our common memory, rather than allowed to fade.